Hi, everyone. If you've joined us nice and early, I'm just going to give it 2 minutes or so before I get started so people have some time to jump in. So grab a coffee or a cup of tea if you'd like, then I'll get started in a few minutes. That's my coffee jingle jangling. All right. Give it one more minute, then I'll get started. All right. Let's get into it. Hi, hello everyone. I'm Kate. I'm from Media Monks, and today I'm going to take you through our third webinar on GA4. So today we're focusing on dual tagging and tagging implementation. So if you've joined us for the last two webinars, welcome back. If you haven't joined us yet, hello. And this session is going to be quite practical and a bit more technical about how you can actually set up data collection in GA4. So yeah, this is a session I'm really excited for because I love to do this stuff myself, and I hope I can help answer any questions you guys have as we go through the content. So just to give you a little bit of background, so I am Kate from Media Monks, as I said, and we are working with Google to deliver the GA4 workshops in APAC for publishers. So this is something that has been sponsored by GNI, the Google News Initiative, and designed to help publishers get set up on GA4 and to make sure that they really know what they're doing with their data and getting the most out of the platform. So as you'd know if you've been here before, I probably sound like a broken record, but I'll just go over it in case anyone's new. We will be running office hours between March and October, as well as implementation support sessions. So if you are interested in getting a bit more of a hands-on or one-to-one coaching on GA4, then please apply for those. They'll be launching pretty soon, so they'd be useful if you have any additional questions after these trainings that you'd like to ask us personally. So yes, keep an eye out on the website. There'll be application links going up really soon where you can apply for those additional support hours. Anyway, that is enough admin. Let's get into the content. So today we are covering a few topics. We're starting off with data foundations. So as I said, we're looking at tagging and data collection today. So it all kind of starts from the actual reason why we do it, which is important to know because with data collection, it's easy to kind of just collect as much data as there is and not necessarily focus on the stuff that's important. We're then going to talk about key events and parameters, so the ones that you should be thinking about setting up for yourself. We're going to talk about implementing GA4 with Google Tag Manager, which is one of the easiest ways to do it. and also the approach and benefits of dual tagging, which some of you might already be doing. And if you're not, it might be something that's worth considering as you make this transition to GA4. Okay, so let's start off with data foundations. So as you would know as publishers, there are many different aspects to a data-driven business. The first one is really important, and this is kind of a soft skill, but it's the culture and ways of working. So you can have the best data team in the world, but if the organization doesn't really understand the need for data, it's not going to make much of a difference. So there's a real importance that, from management down, everyone understands the value of data, they're embedding data into strategy, and that you have that collaboration between different units so that, data is being shared and utilized as much as possible. So that is a very important one. Unfortunately, it's one of the hardest ones to implement, but it's important to keep in mind. Skills within your business are also really important. So, does your editorial team have skills to analyze data? Do they know what they're looking at? Can they visualize data? Or do they have, a dedicated analyst in your organization who can help them to navigate all of that? For some people, data can be really overwhelming. So, you either want to have an upskilled team or to have someone or a group in your organization who can, help communicate data to the broader organization. Technology. So can your teams pull the data directly, or do you need to rely on someone else? Have you thought about using machine learning? What is kind of the realm of technology you want to be in as an organization? And finally, the data consideration. So are you collecting the right data? Do you have everything you need to make decisions? Are your data points connected? So today we're going to focus on that data aspect. That is kind of the foundation of everything, and you can't really go further without having that. So hopefully learning more about the foundation and the reasons that it's important will help you to kind of develop more of a data-driven culture at your organization as well, where you're using GA4 as that cornerstone of your technology stack. Okay, so as you can see, here we have like a nice little pyramid visualization, or I guess not a pyramid, it's just circles stacked on top of each other. A snowman, maybe. Sorry, I'll stop riffing. We've got here a visualization of how these different levels work. So, while having the data-driven culture, as I said, really depends on those business objectives and the business interest. None of that is possible unless you've got the foundations in place to actually make it happen. So, if you have a team that's really interested in using data, but your data collection isn't good, you're not going to get very far. So, it kind of starts with, that culture where you've got the management who understand what your goals are, what your priorities are, and how data can be used to achieve those. So, your priorities, for instance, might be increasing revenue from advertisements, or maybe subscriptions, increasing subscriptions. So those business goals are kind of overarching for your organization, but it's important that management understands why data or how data can help you actually achieve those goals. So the goals or objectives are then translated into use cases. So, I guess it's like the why of data implementation. What are the actual use cases? What are the changes to the bottom line that we can make by actually having all of this data there? And a good example of that is kind of the content planning and recirculation use case, where we're using data to identify really high performing content, or to understand our content and audience, and then actually action that into strategy that should increase revenue. So we have our goals, we have our use cases, and then below that we have the analysis practices that inform our use cases. So, regularly looking into the performance of metrics and segments, making adjustments on your site based on your analysis. That's kind of where we start off. But to do any analysis, we need to have the data collection foundation. And so that's right at the bottom of all of these different levels, up to the top of actually achieving business goals. Right at the bottom, we have the collection of data, making sure you're collecting the data points that you need to get to that end goal. So it does kind of work as like a reverse logic system, where at the start you say, all right, where do we want to end up? And we want to end up as a business that is increasing revenue and increasing subscriptions because we have content planning in place, because we analyze our data, because we've got good data collection. So the data collection is necessary to make the end goal happen, but the end goal should really inform what you're collecting. So it's kind of a weird circle, but if that makes sense, it's the idea that you're looking at your final result that you'd like to achieve, and that informs what you're actually going to collect in the first place. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. You can let me know if that made zero sense to you, and I will explain it again. Anyway, we're going to have a think about some of the data points that you're most likely to want to collect at this initial level to actually go on and achieve business goals that are common for publishers. So first up, we have our data building blocks. So this being a publisher-based workshop, we can kind of identify the general metrics and data points that are going to be important to you. Even within the publisher space, there's so much variety in what your KPIs and your objectives are, but this is a pretty good starting point that's generally consistent amongst all publishers. So as you would know from our last couple of sessions, GA4 as an out-of-the-box platform gives you a lot of insights into your website visitors. So, where your traffic comes from, what they're looking at, what events are happening on the site. So these can help you, have insights into a lot of really important stuff going on the site. But at the end of the day, the great thing about GA4 is that you can customize your data collection to really get the data points that actually are relevant to you. So these are some examples of the data building blocks for a publisher. So first up, you've got your content and metadata. So this is kind of the data about your data, right? Your metadata. So this is where we want to collect labels and tags about your articles and about your site that will help you to actually undertake analysis later on. So some examples of really important metadata to collect, things like article ID, the content type. So is it a video? Is it an article? The content category, depending on your site, might be like, is it a politics article? Is it a sports article? Is it celebrity? The name of the author, publication date, article tags, if you have any additional more specific ones for your particular newsroom, feature type, and paid or free article. So not all of those will be relevant to everyone, but generally that is a good place to start. Definitely, I would recommend always collecting an article ID because that is the unique identifier for your article, and it makes analysis a lot simpler and it enables you to undertake a lot more complex analysis. So article ID is really important. It's always good to collect a category so that you can do that category level analysis instead of just looking at individual articles. And it's always really good to collect a published date as well, so that you can always look at performance over time and understand the lifespan of articles. So I think those three are probably the three that I would say are the most fundamental. Events and actions. So we move on from our metadata and our content data, which would usually be attached to events. So they'd be your parameters in GA4, where you'd say, on page views, we're collecting article ID. On scrolls, we're collecting article ID as well. That's where you would actually set those parameters to collect that data. But now we move on to the events that trigger data collection. So some examples here of publisher-specific ones. Obviously, you're automatically going to be collecting page views and session starts, but these are additional events that are specific to you. The first is article completion. So this one is closely connected to scroll, but it has a bit of a difference. The completion of an article might be a different definition to your business than it is to the out-of-the-box GA4 scroll event. So, your newsroom might define a completion as someone who reads 75% of the page, or maybe you've got a page that has lots of ad space down the bottom. So article completion's actually happening at, 45% down the page, for instance. So that's just something to keep in mind, making sure that the scroll event, if you're using the out-of-the-box one, is actually matching your business definition of article completion. And we're going to look more at how that event is set up a little bit later on. Other examples are things like comments, social shares, so really measuring engagement holistically, not just through page views, but through comments, shares, and completions. Logins, if you have a login system. Newsletter subscriptions, obviously, is a conversion point. Paywall impressions and paywall clicks, so really measuring that full journey of having an impression of a subscription offer and then actually converting. And then, yes, subscription and contribution as well. So that full journey of, seeing an offer, people dropping off, trying to use that data to analyze why they're not converting or to analyze why they do convert, and then trying to change your strategy based around those events. And the final building block we have, these are reader definitions. So these are going to be generally user properties, user level definitions. The first one being reader ID. This is probably more generally known as user ID, but all that it is a unique identifier for your reader. So with GA4, because we are kind of moving more towards a consent-based data collection world, it is encouraged to have a login where readers are, consenting to sharing that first-party data. And with a login comes a user ID. And the good thing about user ID is it makes it a lot easier to identify a reader across different platforms, across different devices, by using that unique identifier that comes with a login instead of just relying on cookies. So if you do have a login in place on your website, highly recommend getting that user ID or reader ID set up. Known versus anonymous. So this is just another bit of metadata where you can say, this is a user that we know because we have a logged in ID for them, or they're anonymous. We don't have any past history of them or any identifier for them. Geography, which will be out of the box. So, which location they're in. Occupation, again, that would be specific to you collecting that information with consent from the user. Age, again, something you can use from demographic reports or something you might be collecting with consent from a user. Number of articles read. So keep in mind that with GA4, we have the idea of lifetime value metrics. So you might implement a number of articles read over time to keep track of all the articles a user has read ever, or you might be looking at it in a particular period. These are important definitions that give us an idea of loyalty and recirculation and re-engagement. Subscriber versus non-subscriber, number of days subscribed, remaining free articles. So again, these aren't all relevant to every single publisher, but these are worth reading through and having a think about whether they might be relevant to you and your newsroom. Okay, so let's have a look at an example of where we would find metadata. So in this example here, we have an article on a website. It's on the Media Monks website. And as you can see, there are certain pieces of information we get about this article that are pretty consistent with all publishers. So first up, we have the idea of a content grouping. So that's kind of the example we've shown here. And this is where it's kind of like a category, something else you might call it. But this is where we're labeling an article based on the group it is in. So the first group is articles, right? Again, these definitions can be whatever your business decides, but in this case, we have this section on the Media Monks website called articles. So the content group, the first content group is articles. That's our broadest grouping. So we might have another group for videos or for blogs. You get the idea. Then we have another level of content grouping where we're getting a bit more specific. So this is more like what you'd think of as a category. And in this case, the category of the article we're looking at is digital marketing. So this is something that is in the CMS because it's up there on the page, and it can be collected as a content group, as an example. So, there's a lot of ways that you can kind of look at your data and cut it and analyze it and decide what content is best, which is, obviously a question with lots of different ways to answer. And you can look at it from the angle of, just article name, so really granular if this is an article that's compared to all articles. Or you can look at it at a higher level like we have here. So content group, is digital marketing doing better than data as a content grouping? And content type, are articles doing better than videos, etc. So because there's so many different ways to cut it and different parts of your business will have different priorities, it's good to collect as much metadata as you can so that you're always ready to do the analysis you want. Because as I'm sure some of you know, there's nothing worse than thinking you've been collecting a lot of data and you haven't. And so then you're unable to do historical analysis and you're kind of left without. So it's always good with, especially in publishing, to collect as much metadata as you can, as much information about the author, the title, the category, publish date, all of that from the get-go, because it's most likely to come in handy. Okay. So next up, this is an example of an event or an action. So the next thing we really want to understand is which articles readers are actually completing. Which ones do they like reading? They might click on it, but that doesn't give us a holistic view of the quality of an article or of reader engagement. So I gave an example before that you can see illustrated here. So on our Media Monks website, we have this page, and the article's actually less than 50% of the way down the page. Sorry, the completion of the article is less than 50% of the way down the page. So in our case, we can't necessarily use an out-of-the-box scroll event that will just look for the 90% vertical page length. We have to have a custom event that we set up that will recognize when someone is at 50% of the page length, okay? And again, you might, as a business, say that article completion is 75% down the page, or 80% down the page, or 95%. So if you have a specific definition, it's good to use a custom event that's going to fire it exactly where you want it to. So often with publishers, we find that they're not tracking completion at all, or they're just using scroll depth tracking, and that scroll depth tracking doesn't reflect reading completions precisely because it's based on that overall page length. And your article on a lot of websites will often have a lot of non-article stuff on the rest of the page that doesn't actually matter to completion of the article. So this metric is, really important. It helps you understand content engagement. It gives you really an extra dimension on understanding your article performance than just page views. So have a think about the way completions are defined on your site. Think about if the out-of-the-box scroll event is going to work for you, or if you will need a custom event to really capture the right level of article completion. Okay, so another event example we have here is paywall impressions and also paywall clicks. So often you will be, as a publisher, measuring total number of subscriptions, which is kind of a post-factum way of measuring that conversion. So you're only measuring it after it's happened, right? Which is good and should be done, but don't forget that there are opportunities to understand how non-subscribers are behaving as well to try to turn them into subscribers. So depending on how the paywall works on your site, maybe it's its own page, maybe it's a little iframe that pops up, totally depends on your own site. You should be able to measure an impression of that paywall, right? So to be able to measure whenever a user actually sees that pop up in their screen and sees the offer, and by tracking that impression, as well as tracking the actual conversion, you can analyze, okay, which articles led to conversions and which articles didn't. And is there a category that people are converting on? Is there some kind of aspect of this data that is showing more of a propensity to actually lead to a conversion? So I think a good example would be, if you had an article that you'd seen had heaps of conversion events and you thought, okay, that's great. But then once you implemented impression tracking, you saw that the percentage of, impressions to clicks wasn't actually that good, then you would have a totally different perspective on the value of that article for conversions. And you might find there's another article that isn't as highly promoted on the site that has a really high click-through rate. So that might inform the way you want to, present different articles to non-subscribers, or how you might want to structure your newsletter or homepage or content recommendations. It might just give you an insight that you didn't expect into what's driving people to convert. So another important thing to note is that, you might have different types of subscription offers and tierings. And by capturing, a little bit of metadata in a parameter that's, offer type or offer cost or whatever, you might get a better idea of the different offers that are appealing to people, and it might help you kind of A/B test your strategy of offering different subscription models. So definitely recommend, if you do have a subscription model, tracking paywall impressions. It does involve a bit of work with your developers to make sure you know how to capture that impression with a data layer event, which we'll talk about a bit later. But it is certainly worth doing if you do have a subscription-based model. Okay, so I've spoken a lot about the events you should implement. Now I'm going to give you a bit of a look into how we actually do it, which is the part people tend to not know as much about, but I think it's very interesting, and I think it's worth everyone understanding, even if you're not, on the technical side of things yourself. So if we think about the structure of a website, publisher website specifically, you've got a whole lot of stuff happening in the back end. So you've got the CMS, which is where you're actually putting together your articles and content, and it's the way the whole website is structured to present your articles and your newsroom to everybody. You have maybe a CRM, which is where you keep information about your subscribers, perhaps. So like maybe just newsletter subscribers if you don't have a subscription model. But it's where you keep records about your actual registered users. And then you might also have a subscription system, which is where you manage your paid subscribers, and you'll have the information about, who they are. So you've got kind of those three things working in tandem in the background. And then what the reader actually sees is the front end, which is your website. So all of these things are happening in the background. All the reader is seeing is the website. Then those things in the background, those platforms, will give you an idea about who your reader is based on their status, right? So when I go to the website, the subscription system will say whether or not I'm a subscriber. The CRM will say, whether or not I'm registered, for instance. And so that will inform whether or not the website will show me, paywall articles or show me an advertisement for an article, for instance. So that's kind of all happening in the background, and that's what informs what you see as a reader, is like based on whether or not you're logged in, for instance, whether or not you're subscribed to the right tier. So then what we can do is on the front end of the website, we can send information from the CMS side all the way to the console on the front end that tells us about this reader and it helps us to measure this data. So the way we do this is with something called a data layer. And if you're not familiar with this, it is something that can be established with your developers, and it's like a structured code block that lives in the back end and sends messages to the front end for relevant interactions. Okay, so for instance, if I open an article about sports, you might have worked with your developers to send a message to the data layer that says, article ID 12345, article name. Here's why we like sports. This is why I'm not doing the publisher job side of things. Category sports, subscriber, yes, subscriber ID 123456, whatever. So that data is pushed from the back all the way into the front to be then collected by tag management. Okay, so that's how it actually works. That's how you actually get all of this information about your article and the category of it and the ID of it and all of that into the data layer for collection. Okay, so there are ways to do data collection without a data layer, namely site scraping, which is where we just use JavaScript to kind of literally scrape words and elements off the site. So I might, go and scrape the name of an author based on the site code, but that is very error prone, and best practice is most definitely to use a data layer instead. So to invest a little bit of time to get a code block structure written out, give it to your developers so they can push it through to the front end for your analysis. So from the data layer, that's where we can use Google Tag Manager or any tag management platform to really easily collect those data points in tags. So when it's in the data layer, this job becomes really easy. It becomes something you can do without knowing basically any JavaScript at all. From Tag Manager, it gets sent to Analytics, so in our case, into GA4. And then Analytics obviously can integrate with your subscription systems or with your GAM platform or other advertising supply-side platform, and can also be exported out for visualization. So this part here is what we're focusing on today, this key point of data collection. And even just knowing the word data layer, I think can help if you have no idea how to start collecting data on your site. Okay, I'm about to move into another section, but I want to answer a couple of questions first. So first question I have, why is there a red triangle with exclamation marks shown next to a few metrics? For example, traffic acquisition or users. Is there no option to categorize the data in week, month, or year rather than days only? As in, I need to find monthly trend over 2 years. Is monthly split possible? Okay, good question. I might have to get back to you on this because I know how to do it in UA. I know that you can change the default aggregation, but I don't think I've tried to do that in GA4 before. But on this, on the platform that we're using here with Meet with Google, I can leave you some responses to comments. So I'll try and see if I can get you an answer and respond there if that's all right. Because yeah, I actually haven't tried to do that before, but if it's the same terminology as UA, it's like a date aggregation toggle that you can use to change into a different granularity of how you're aggregating dates. So you can change it to monthly, for instance. I'm guessing the red triangle is another question. The second question, for example, traffic acquisition or users. So that will pop up when you, I believe that will pop up when you're dealing with either sampled data. Yeah, I think that will apply when you're dealing with some sampling of data. So if you're on a free GA model and you've hit like a limit of events that will then enforce sampling, I'm pretty sure that's the reason behind that. But again, I'll just let you know when I respond a bit later. Okay, hi. In the following use case, how does the source of traffic get calculated? User clicks on the Facebook feed and reads the article up to the first paragraph. User searches about the article but reaches the homepage, navigates to article, reads the article in full, where there'll be one user calculated in GA4. Okay, so here's what will happen in this case. If a user clicks on the Facebook feed and gets to your site, the source will be defined as Facebook, as long as you've got your UTM parameters set up correctly, which I'd recommend doing to make sure it goes into the right channel. So the source for the session will be Facebook. If it's the user's first ever session on your site, their user source will also be Facebook. Okay, so you'll have two different source concepts in GA4. The first is source session level, which is for every individual session, where did I come from? So that might be Facebook for this event, then it might be Google for another one. And you also have first user source, so the initial source that I came from ever as a recognized user, which would be Facebook in this situation. Then user searches about the article, reaches the homepage, goes to the article and reads it in full. So that will be counted as long as it's happening within the session definition. So the no more than 30 minutes between events, that'll be the same session. If it happens, a day later, it will be a different session, and their new source will be for that session will be Google. So the customer journey, as long as they haven't cleared their cookies, you will still recognize that as the same person. They'll have their first user source and they'll have session sources as well. But that particular person is identified as the same. To do that kind of analysis, if you're looking at that kind of attribution, usually you'd want to have a conversion event, but that would kind of enable you to do that level of attribution. But otherwise, using tools like BigQuery can be really helpful in looking at those paths. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the use case is for that question, but kind of the long and short of it is that your session sources will be relevant to every individual session you have, but you also have the concept of your initial source. If you can type, let me see. Okay, I think, let me see. Sorry, I'm just reading and muttering to myself. Getting with the traffic, any way to track author page views, respective articles. Multiple aggregators from where we're getting most of the traffic. We have multiple aggregators from where we are getting most of the traffic. Is there any way to track author page views for the respective articles along with multiple aggregators? Yes, there is. So in that case, that's where you'll be using source. Okay, so you can build a report either by using some out-of-the-box reports and adding secondary dimensions for author, or you can use the explore section in GA4. You can, make your primary dimension author, and your secondary dimension can be session source. And that way you can see, which aggregators people are coming from by author and by article if you want. So yes, it's certainly possible to combine those two data points because, every view of that article will have the source they came from attached. So as long as all of your UTMs from those sources, those aggregators are working okay, you should be able to see those referrers alongside the author, absolutely, and then using page views as a metric. I have a question about AMP data, what to use to push data if we're using AMP. Does that not work with JavaScript? So GA4 currently doesn't support AMP, but there is that implementation is on its way. It's on the roadmap. So at the moment, unfortunately, I think there isn't an automatic tracking unless you have a solution internally, but just keep an eye out for announcements on that because it is certainly on the roadmap for tracking. And one more, it seems like out of the box GA4 will replace having to use the Google News tagging guide. Is that correct? That's a good question. I wouldn't say it would necessarily replace it because in your news tagging guide, you might have had suggestions to track things like your subscription events, for instance, and also you want to make sure you're collecting all of your metadata. So I think in the news tagging guide, and I don't know it perfectly off the top of my head, so I might be wrong, but you're requested to collect things like article ID and category, as I was mentioning before. You'll still need to make sure those are being collected in your events and not necessarily just using the out-of-the-box parameters. So if you have a look on Google support, there is a list of the automatically collected events and automatically collected parameters. So that's things like page path, page location, blah, 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 blah. Those are automatically collected, but they're not necessarily going to have like your metadata attached. So things like author and publish date and content ID, that's set in your individual publishing CMS. So you need to push through those data points and tell GTM how to collect them to get them at the end. So yes, the short answer is it definitely doesn't replace the news tagging guide. I would still use that to inform the metadata you should be collecting and just making sure you're filling in the gaps between the automatically collected events and what you want to have as a publisher. Okay, cool. Hope that helps. I'm going to move on to the next section for now, but I'll try to come back to the rest of your questions later on. Okay, so key events and parameters. So we've talked about the importance of data foundations to business goals. So now I want to talk about measurement objectives and the best practices of using them to achieve business goals. So the first step in achieving your business objectives through data is to actually identify what they are. So as I said earlier, you kind of want to know what your end goal is and what your objectives are before you start doing your data collection, because that end goal tells you what you need to collect. So you can kind of work backwards to get to that initial point. So it's crucial to understand what is what and where you stand as a business from a data perspective, and to not just jump the gun pursuing advanced goals without the foundations sorted. So you might sit down with your team and just say, all right, what do we think our goals are? More ad impressions, more revenue from ads, better reader retention, more subscriptions, better subscriber retention. Those are some examples. And then you'll go, okay, well, how do we actually measure success within those goals? So this is step 2, putting down KPIs. So you might say, for instance, okay, well, if we want to increase ad revenue, then we might have, this many impressions, or this high of a CPM, or this high of a fill rate as a KPI for that. Okay, so an actual metric that you can connect with that goal. So now we're getting a bit more concrete, right? We've gone from these kind of vague objectives to concrete metrics that identify or that prove you've achieved that. Then you can say, okay, we want to know what our impressions and CPM are. Well, how do we actually collect that data? And this is where you start to establish the data foundations. This is when you design your data collection plan and you say, all right, we need to collect, page views, completions, ad impressions, CPMs. We need to collect, subscriptions, days since subscribed, number of articles read, blah, 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 blah. Whatever it is, that's how you actually decide what data points you need to collect, as well as the metadata. So, the important, like the kind of fundamental ones, like content ID, category, and publish date, as well as anything else that's relevant. So author, is a user a subscriber or not, subscriber ID, blah, 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 blah. So that point in step 3 is where we're deciding what the collection is. And then step 4 is the hard part, because you've got to do some things with data. This is where we analyze and experiment. So this is where you want to establish a cadence of data-driven processes in your organization. So you want to have a flow from your newsroom and commercial team and marketing team where everyone's constantly measuring, looking at data, and experimenting. So you might do this through dashboards, for instance, a daily dashboard that says, here's content performance against our metrics, here's overall performance of subscriptions or of ad revenue. And here in our dashboard, we're looking at the best performing things and the articles that need to be optimized, for instance. And then that informs the newsroom about the strategy they want to take, or the marketing team on the strategy they want to take, or the commercial team on how they decide to structure subscription plans. So the idea is that you got your goal, KPI, data collection to actually achieve that, and then the actual analysis of the data you're receiving and making improvements through experiments. Okay, so this is kind of the overall process, the way we want to handle this data-driven transformation. So before we go into the technical stuff, we want to establish the most valuable use cases for each publisher. So this ensures that as a publisher, you'll be able to activate your data and achieve your results and not get stuck in analysis paralysis, which is such a good term and would definitely be my band name. So what that means there is, like, you don't want to just collect everything possible. You want to collect the pieces of data that are actually relevant to your business's goals. And as we've said many times, even within the publishing space, they can be really varied. So you want to focus on the data that matters. So, if your KPI is just ad impressions, you don't care about subscriptions, then you're going to collect impression data, CPM data, page view data, and you're going to focus on analyzing that data and activating it, instead of just collecting everything and then putting everything in a dashboard and not knowing where to look. Okay, so it's better just to focus on something specific and really action it than to collect everything and never do anything with it, right? So on the one hand, you don't want to jump the gun and get someone, a publisher who's like brand new to data, to go straight into subscription analysis if they don't have the foundations in place. So we don't want people to say, all right, we're interested in data-driven culture, let's do some machine learning, if you're not even collecting metadata. You need to start small and grow from there. And we also want to establish the best practice data collection, so that even if you are starting small, you're going in with a really robust system, which makes it so much easier to go into the machine learning. So I work with lots of different clients in lots of different verticals. And, often if we have a really complex task for them, we end up having to go back to basics because you need to make sure you've got that basic data stuff. And it seems like silly and a waste of time, but it's incredibly important. And you can't do the hard stuff without that. So that's where you want to really focus your initial time and effort. So in terms of steps on towards actually growing the revenue, you want to start off with that analysis of your content and your readers. So collecting data on content category, content type, whatever, and on who your readers are and analyzing that. You then want to come up with the right offer for the right audience. So looking at how different offers are performing, be it for subscriptions or otherwise. And then finally, you want to work on retention. So you've engaged your readers, they've converted, and now you want to keep them happy, keep them satisfied with what you're offering, and keep them loyal to the site. So it's that 1, 2, 3 process that we can always be thinking of in tandem as well. So in terms of engaging readers, what would some of the metrics look like for this? And this is an example of how you might, in your organization, decide on your KPIs and build your measurement and data collection plan. So engaging readers might look to your organization like growing your brand lovers. So growing the size of your audience that's coming back every single day or every single week and reading lots of articles. That might be success to you. And the way you'd measure that would be, number of users in the segment, number of page views, and recirculation rate. And as a heads up, all 3 of those things can be measured with out-of-the-box GA4. Those are the 3 things that you can figure out. Just using out-of-the-box GA4, the third one might involve a little bit of BigQuery, but in any case, the data collection is quite simple for that. So, it's not reinventing the wheel. Even though there is a lot of thought that goes into this first data collection step, a lot of the actual metrics you're collecting aren't that complicated. You just want to know why you're collecting them before you start collecting everything. Your KPI might be increasing subscriptions. So to do that, you would want to be measuring subscription events, or you might want to look at the percentage conversion rate. Your KPI might be improving engagement via newsletter. So maybe you really want to work on investing in the newsletter performance. And so to measure that, you'd look at percentage of engaged sessions for newsletter-led landings. Again, something that's just measurable out of the box with GA4. Finally, you might want to set a KPI as being increasing your logged in reader base. And you would measure that by looking at your percentage of monthly users, your percentage of monthly users that are logged in. So again, seems pretty logical, but just writing it down in a plan like this is incredibly important because that helps you keep track and keep a control of all the metrics that you're actually going to pay attention to. Next up, the converting and monetizing. So your KPIs for this might be something like growing your subscriber base if you have a subscription system. So to measure that, you'd look at the number of monthly conversion events and the percentage of users that are subscribed. Your KPI might be incrementing paid subscribers. So looking at the percentage of paid subscribers that you have. So looking, out of our big user base, are we increasing the percentage that are paid as compared to our percentage of free users or amongst our logged in users? Are we increasing that share of our audience? You might have a KPI to improve your meter stop rate. So you might measure that by looking at the percentage of exits that you get on paywalled articles and trying to bring that percentage down and bring the percentage of subscriptions after paywall impressions up. And again, this is kind of the next one, increasing paywall efficiency. So the click-through rate on those paywall impressions, increasing that might be the way you want to measure conversion and monetization. And finally, the third objective is retaining users. So to retain users, again, this comes back to the reader experience on the site. You want to improve the engagement of your subscribers and secure renewals. So if your KPI is improving subscriber engagement, you can do this by measuring the number of sessions per month, the number of pages per session for subscribers. And I'd also throw in another one, which is the number of days since their most recent session, if that makes sense. Yeah, so you want to have your subscribers coming back frequently and not taking long breaks of 3 or 4 weeks between sessions, for instance. So that's another one to think about. If your KPI is securing renewals, you can measure, the number of subscription events for subscribed users. So looking at how the percentage of renewals is happening, how many are continuing to subscribe, and trying to keep that percentage going up over time. So those were some of the best practice examples for how you can take that data-driven approach to defining your objectives, defining your KPIs, and then designing your measurement. As you can see, it's not really that complicated. It just involves sitting down, knowing your objectives, and thinking about how you can actually concretely define them and measure them. But highly recommend just having a Google Sheet, with 8 rows, 3 columns where you put all this in there. It definitely makes a difference in helping you get started with data collection if it's an intimidating concept to you. So once all of this is in place, this is where you can actually use these metrics to measure and analyze your data and to experiment and figure out what it is that you can do on your site to keep those KPIs being met and exceeded. Okay. Oh, all right. Another section. I'm going to answer 2 of the outstanding questions before I keep going. Had a follow-up on my answer about aggregators, where they're getting most of their traffic and wanting to track author page views. Follow-up has said that sending too many events, which causes sampling of the data. We've experienced that in our Universal Analytics while tracking author page views with titles. Okay, interesting. So I just want to check if you're using parameters on events as your method of data collection. I would just make sure, and sorry if I'm saying something you've already done, you have to follow up again, but I would just make sure that you, in your GA4 configuration tag, if you're doing it through GTM or even GTag, that you're always collecting those metadata points, so author, ID, blah, 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 because that shouldn't result in extra page views being sent. You should just have that one page view event when someone lands on an article that should have metadata of author, which would be an event parameter, and should also automatically collect the source of the session. That shouldn't result in more events. If you're just collecting page views there, you shouldn't have to collect any other type of events. But again, I might be misunderstanding, but I would just make sure that all of those parameters are being collected in that one page view and not in additional events, for instance. So what I mean is you don't need to have an event that's called, author name or something like that. You can collect all of that on your page view. I hope I've understood. Apologies if I haven't. Feel free to follow up again. And another question, is there a way to export a live feed of page views to Google Sheets so you can get the data updated automatically in a report rather than having to navigate through GA4 every time you need an update? Yes, this is something I've done before using the real-time API. So the GA4 real-time API is an improvement on UA. It's really great. I've used it a fair bit already. So Google that. Google the GA4 API, and you'll see that you can use Google Apps Script. Basically it's an extension on Google Sheets. You need to have a teeny bit of JavaScript knowledge to do it, but you can probably find examples online that can help you. And you can open up an app script and you can tell it to connect with the GA4 API and basically input page titles or article names, whatever it is, and page views, and it can automatically update every however many minutes. So it's a little bit technical, but there is certainly a way to do it. I've done it before many times. So just look at the Google Analytics 4 API for real time and look at Google Apps Script. And there's lots of really clever solutions there that you can use to access that data completely for free. So have a look at that. Okay, let's get into the fun stuff, which is Google Tag Manager. So we've spoken about these data foundations and kind of like the business side of why we collect these things. So now we're going to show you how this actually happens technically. I know because I work a lot with developers in my role that sometimes I can be intimidated to ask questions because I'm worried I'm going to sound really stupid. Um, so I think it really helps just knowing some of the terminology, even if you're not going to do this work yourself. It's good to know why we do things and what is actually happening on the developer side so that you know what to ask for. You certainly don't need to know how to do all this data layer stuff, but if you kind of know how to create one and work with your developers, it makes it so much easier because they can be tricky to get a handle on. So how do we actually implement data collection? So I touched on this earlier when we were looking at that model of how your website is structured, how you've got your CMS, your CRM, and your subscription system, and then how that will inform, what the user is seeing, and then it will send information to the data layer about what's going on the site. So to create a data layer, it doesn't just happen automatically. Developers on your site need to push events into the console, as it's called. And these basically are like these structured data pushes that will contain information about the page you're on, the user, the site, blah, blah, blah. So the first step is to, as we've said, identify your required data points. So that's what we just did when we looked at all those metrics we need. Say, for instance, you said, all right, we need to track article completions at 75%, and we want to collect the content name, the author name, the published date, the content ID, the content category. So you've got this list here where you say, these are all the metadata we want to collect. These are the events we want to collect, so 75% scrolls, subscription events, paywall impressions, blah, blah, blah. And you put them all in a document called a solution design. So this is something that you hand over to your developers. And I can guarantee you'll get a lot further if you go to your developers and say, hello, here's the solution design. Can you help me put this on the site? Then if you say, hey, can you help me collect author? Then we'll get nothing. So a solution design is simply just like a Google sheet or just a spreadsheet that has the events you want to collect, the elements you want to collect with them. I think it's something that you can probably build in collaboration with developers and not need to do much of the code setting yourself. But if that's something you can do, or if you've got support to do that, it's always great to kind of get the code snippets set up yourself in the solution design. But in any case, you can sit down with your developers and say, we want you to push an event every time someone sees a paywall that's called paywall impression. And we want you to also tell us when that happens, what's the name of the article they're on, what's the ID of the article they're on, what's the name of the author, for instance. And the developer will say, yep, okay, put it in a solution design. So just write it down on a sheet. And then we're going to put it into a data layer. So then the developers go into the back end of the site and they tell the site to send these events whenever that happens on the reader side. So that when I'm reading an article and I get a paywall impression, the data layer goes, boom, paywall impression event, and here's all the information about the article I'm on. Okay, so it really is just a way of sending messages from the back of the website that has all the information about your articles and your readers to the front end, all right, in the data layer. That's what the data layer is. It's like a little messenger service. If you do have, this is step 3 now, if you do have an app, your developers will also implement Firebase tracking for data collection on mobile apps, which works really similarly to the web collection, especially now that we have GA4. So similar to a data layer, your app would, with Firebase, you'd push an event that says, 75% scroll with all the parameters attached. Then once your developers have said, all right, we did it, we put that article impression or that article scroll event on the site, it's on the data layer, you will then be able to go onto your website and in the console, if you're feeling clever, type in data layer and see the events coming through. So basically the point is that like once the data layer is on the site, you're then able to use Google Tag Manager to pick up those pieces of data and send those tags to GA4. So we have identify data points and tell the developers what you want them to collect. Step 2, developers go off and they put those events in the data layer. Step 3, optional, they will put them on app. And step 4, you use Google Tag Manager to pick up everything out of that data layer. So it's gone all the way from that back end of the website to being collected by Google Tag Manager on the front end. Okay, that's kind of an overview of the data layer. So if we think about what this thing actually is, it's a JavaScript object that passes information from your website to the container. So as I said, it's a little messenger service that sits just above your website. So you've got your website with all the data in the back end about your readers and articles. Data layer sits there on top of it in a structured format that we can then read with Google Tag Manager and then send that data out to GA4 or Facebook or Campaign Manager or whatever. So it's a little messenger service. The object is made up of a list of key value pairs. So when we say structured data, what I mean is, it will have, event name, paywall impression. So that's a key event name, value, paywall impression. Or it will have, the key of content author and the value of Kate, or the key of article ID and the value of 1234. So it's just little pairs of data that get pushed out to collect in Google Tag Manager. So here's an example of what one looks like. I probably should have said this earlier instead of just using my fingers in the air to explain what I'm saying. So this is an example of a data layer push that we might have for a page view. And I think this is relevant to that question I answered before about ensuring you're collecting these parameters on page view, right? So if you are using your data layer to collect page views, or to push page views, sorry, you can have your developers push through all this additional information from the back end whenever the page view event happens. So here they have said, all right, when a page loads, we're going to send this event called page view. So that's the key event. The value is page view. And we're going to attach these parameters. So content title. And this, again, is from the CMS because it's in the site code. So the name of the article, the type of the article, the category, the author name, the publication date, and the tags. So some of this information might not be necessarily present on the page itself. It might just be in the backend in the code base. That's fine. As long as it's available somewhere, usually the developers can push it through in the data layer. So we end up in the console. So if I opened this page right now, I would see this event come through with all this information in my console. Now, that means that from there, we can use Google Tag Manager to pick up that information. So the next step is where we actually collect it and send it to GA4. So in that example I gave just then, the event was page view and all the data that came along with it, all that contextual metadata stuff, would be our parameters. Okay, so that's the GA4 terminology: event, page view, parameters, all these things. Then, oh, sorry, I'm going all over the place. So when Tag Manager loads a container, and this just means that if you've got it installed on your site, so I open this page and Tag Manager initializes because it's been installed on the site and it goes, all right, we're ready to collect data. When that happens, all the queued data layer push messages start to get processed. So Tag Manager sits there and it waits for messages from the data layer to come in. And if it's been told to read them, then it will turn them into tags. So I might have a Tag Manager event set up that triggers whenever we have a page view. And so we'll see that message come through from the data layer, and then it will collect all the metadata and it will fire the tag, and off it goes to GA. Okay, so it's kind of like that intermediary between your website and the actual platform you're sending it to. So obviously it can send it to Facebook if you want as a pixel or somewhere else. It's kind of that intermediary that sends the tags out to different places. So the way this works is it's the messages are taken as a first in, first out basis. So if you have multiple tags that are all fired by page view, then you can use priorities to say fire this one first, fire this one second, blah, 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 blah. But generally, all the tags will fire based on the way they come up in the data layer. So you might want to double check that you've got, page view firing first, then you've got article scroll, for instance, so that those tags fire in the order you expect. So The next concept we want to talk about in Google Tag Manager land is variables. So variables are used to pass those parameters to GA4. Now, these are basically placeholders that we create in Google Tag Manager, and they'll populate when there's matching code on the website. So for instance, I can create a variable called content group, and I can say, look at the data layer, it's a data layer variable, and simply tell it the name of that variable, and that's what will be collected. So this variable exists in GTM to collect the value of content group whenever it appears. So variables are really important, especially with your metadata and parameters, and you can use them both in triggers and tags. So in triggers, your variable is used to define when the tag should fire. So it might say, only fire this tag when the URL variable contains this. But generally, you're going to use them more in tags, and you're going to use them to capture the parameters to capture the parameters for your events. So, for example, collecting content group on the page view, right? So we'll have a tag for page view, and we'll collect this parameter as a variable. Triggers, these are the things that actually tell GTM when to fire a tag. So it's kind of like a set of conditions that when they're met will cause a tag to fire. So for instance, when you're using the data layer, you will have, as I've said, you might have an event from your developers in the data layer that's called article completed, and you'll have this trigger, and GTM goes, all right, if that trigger shows up, we're going to fire this tag. Okay, so the tags always have triggers attached, and that's actually what makes them fire. So, in this case as well, the page view event, we might have our page view tag will have the trigger of event equals page view, and that will cause the tag to actually fire. So that's what a trigger is. And next up, something I've mentioned, we have the GA4 config tag. So this is the tag that actually initializes Google Analytics for your GA4 property on a page. And this will send a page view every time it's fired, so you don't need to collect page views separately. So as I was saying before, this is where you can say to GTM, I want you to always collect these parameters on every page view. So as a publisher, that will probably include fields like content ID, content name, article author, for instance, blah, blah, blah. So that configuration tag is like your most basic page view tag that will fire on every page. So it's very important. Nothing else works without the config tag. And the way you set it up can make it a lot easier to collect parameters on your site, because you can make sure you're always collecting the most important ones on every page view. So you want to have this on every page on the site, and you want to trigger this as soon as possible. So before any other GA4 tags are fired, you want the config tag to fire, because this will basically set the settings for every other tag that fires on the page. So there is if you are getting into the technical side of things, there is an element in GTM called priorities, and you can tell GTM to fire this with a higher priority than anything else that matches the same trigger conditions. So for instance, if you have a page view tag that fires Facebook pixels, you might set a higher priority for the GA4 config tag so that this always fires before Facebook pixel or before another GA4 tag on the page. So this is what the GA4 config tag looks like. We've got our measurement ID. So that's when you set up a property in GA4 and you have a data stream, you'll have a measurement ID attached. That's what you enter in here to tell GTM where to send the data. And that will tell it to send it, to this particular data stream in this property in GA4. You've got the fields to set. Again, these are the out-of-the-box parameters where you can, put fields that need to be set on every page, like article ID or article title. You've got user properties, so anything that you want to collect for every user. So maybe like is logged in, is subscriber, reader ID, for instance, those things. And you've got your trigger. So when do we actually fire the tag? It's based on, in this case, consent initialization, or it might be based on a data layer event called page view, whatever it is for your particular site. And then we also have, aside from the config tag, just our regular tags. So these are where we handle all of our other custom events that aren't page views. And basically, these are segments of code that help you to send data to different platforms. So here we're talking specifically about GA4 tags, but you can also use tags to send data to Facebook or to other vendors by using code snippets that they give you. Now, fortunately, with GTM for Google Analytics 4, you can just use a template, so that GA4 tag template, and just tell GTM, what the event name is and what your parameters are and how to trigger it. So you don't need to add these tags directly to your sites. With GTM, you can control everything within the tag manager, which is great because it means you don't have to constantly be asking developers to put new tags on the site. You just need to have that GTM container, and then you can set up all the tags yourself. And if you have a data layer, this is well within the capabilities of anyone who uses GA already to be able to learn how to set up tags like this. And if we look here at an example of a normal GA4 tag, so you'll see that we've got our tag type as GA4 event. That in that case, it will ask us what our config tag is, because again, that will tell us the settings for the tag and what the parameters are that it should always collect. And so in this case, you'd put your GA4 config tag. Again, if you're already collecting things like article ID and article name, etc., in the config tag, then they'll be automatically collected on all tags that are configured with this one. So that's just a heads up. You don't need to tell it to do it twice. You'll have your event name, so the thing that will show up in GA4, and in this case, it's article completed. Any additional parameters, so maybe you're not always collecting content group, so you'll chuck that onto this tag. And then the variable that actually holds that value. So what we looked at earlier, a variable that collects values from the data layer. And then finally, the trigger. So what's the custom event that will make this tag fire? Again, hopefully it is something from the data layer. Just put in the name of the event and off it goes. So yes, I hope that this has been a little bit helpful if you had no idea about GTM. I know it seems like a lot, and it does take a while, and it's good to spend time on it. But if you work with your developers and get a data layer in place, I highly encourage you to do a little crash course in GTM online, because being able to set these tags up yourself is so great. It gives you so much more control over the data you're collecting, and it really isn't too hard if you've got a nice data layer in place. Okay. All right. I have one more section to show you guys, then we'll have a little bit of time for questions at the end. So the final topic I wanted to go over is dual tagging. So this is probably something relevant to most of you. So if you're using UA and you want to migrate to GA4, an approach you should probably consider is dual tagging. Now, the good thing with this is that if you've already set up UA using GTM, you can reuse a lot of that existing setup to make your GA4 tags. So the migration is not too tricky if you're already tracking Universal Analytics in GTM. So what does this involve? Basically, dual tagging just means that we're sending events to both UA and GA4 properties. And remember that your hit limits for these properties are distinct. So this doesn't mean that you're suddenly going to reach your event count because you're doing dual tagging. The two properties are independent. So don't worry about sampling on either one in that situation. It just depends on the amount of events you're collecting in the individual property. So that's just a heads up initially. So with dual tagging, you can keep your UA implementation in place while you build out your GA4 implementation. So this is something I've done with most of my clients over the last couple of years while we've been getting migrated onto GA4, is keeping UA in place while we slowly build up GA4 so that we can keep that consistency of tracking, and it won't be like such a big dramatic switchover where we're scrambling to get everything done on time. So if you're not doing dual tagging, I'd highly recommend giving it a go. If you're using GTM, as I said, it's not too hard. So as you can see in this example here, if you have a trigger that you're using for a UA event, then this can be used to fire a GA4 event. The main difference is just that these tags are structured differently. As you know, there's a different data model in GA4 to UA, but pretty much everything you need to build a GA4 event will already exist in GTM if you've got that event set up for Universal. So something like the event category will be a variable that you can then make an event parameter. Same with things like the action and the label, for instance. Those can all be parameters, as well as any custom dimensions and metrics. So because we just have that concept of an event parameter in GA4, that's where you can store all of those labels and tags and custom values about your data. And you simply need to choose a new event name that will suit your GA4 environment. So the benefits of this approach. First up is historical data. So GA4 won't bring in any historical data you've tracked in UA because it is a completely different data model. So it's only going to start collecting data once you set it up. So the sooner you set up dual tagging, the more of that historical data you'll have in place when you do make the switch. So it means that in 4 months' time, when you switch over, you're not going to go in with zero data. You're going to go in with data from now until then. So you've got a bit to work with to try and understand this new data model. Benefit 2 is you can use a common data layer. So if you've already got a data layer on your site, that is amazing news because you can just use that to set up your GA4 tags. And provided you don't need any more events, then there's no more development required. You can just go into GTM, make all your tags with that existing data layer. And thirdly, it gives you more time to get used to the new interface and reporting. So as we know, GA4 is a really different product to UA. So it might be a bit of a steep learning curve if you're not familiar with UA or you're not familiar with Firebase. So this gives you a bit more time to get used to the new tool without being totally dependent on it. This is something I've done with a lot of my clients as well, as that, the ones who know UA really well, for instance, we're kind of slowly migrating over to this new interface so that it's not too much of a shock. And, they have time to get used to it before they completely stop using UA. So a lot of good reasons to do this. So to map your events, it's good to have a little bit of a measurement plan in place. So just to kind of have a list of your current UA events and how you want to label them in GA4. So in terms of mapping events, though, there are a few steps to take. The first is that you want to check if there's already an enhanced measurement event. So for instance, if you're tracking scrolls in UA and you want to use the enhanced measurement event in GA4 for scrolls, then you won't need to do an additional mapping in GTM. Or, if you're tracking things like file downloads in UA and you're just using the enhanced measurement version for GA4, you won't need to do a mapping there. Secondly, you want to look for automatically collected events that match. So, things like page views and stuff like that, you're not going to need to make an equivalent because you'll just use your config tag. And looking for a matching recommended event is the next thing to do. So have a look at the recommended events that are in GA4 and implement your tagging to trigger that recommended event. So just to keep in mind that your new tagging implementation should have some of these if you think they're relevant to you. Then if you can't find an equivalent, so if none of these give you an equivalent to what you had in UA, you'll create a custom event. So this is just a first step to take just to save yourself some time and effort, because you might find that a lot of these events are already recommended or automatically collected. But if not, then you'll make a custom event in GA4 to match the one you had in UA. So yes, I would recommend for this approach, I generally export my events from either GTM or UA interface. And then I kind of make a big spreadsheet and I decide, what's the event name going to be in GA4 and what are my parameter names going to be. And then I simply can go into GTM, make a new tag that's GA4 and, put in my event name and my parameters. And because I've already collected all that data in UA, the variables are all there, the triggers are all there. So it's simply a matter of just mapping to the GA4 model. Okay. That was my full spiel on GTM and data collection. I'm going to answer another question that's come in. Feel free to put some more in if you have any, because I can stick around for another 15 minutes or so to answer questions. But if you do need to depart, just an overview of what we covered today again, data foundations, the events you want to collect and parameters, using GTM to implement GA4 and the approach and benefits of dual tagging. And then the next webinar session, so that'll be content planning and recirculation on Thursday in 2 days. So if you're interested in talking about use cases for some of the data collection we've discussed today, come along to that. It'll be 3:30 Sydney time, whatever that is in your time zone. So yes, that's going to be more about strategy and analysis. So a bit less technical if you're not as into the technical stuff we did today. Again, always happy to hear your feedback on the session. So you'll see that next to the completed webinar on the website. And again, remember that we do have applications open for individual office hours. So please apply if you're interested in getting some additional assistance in those office hours or cohort or one-on-one sessions. Okay, thank you if you have to head off, but otherwise I'll answer some of the questions. Okay, so can you show what code needs to be implemented to fire the event for article completion? Okay, cool. So most of the work involved there will be with your developers to make sure that they can fire an event at the part of the page you want it to fire. So if I go back here, show you an example of a data layer push. The data layer push you see here for page view, right? What you effectively want is a similar structure to this, but with an event name like article completion, and you just want to work with your developers to make it fire at the right point on the page. So usually that will be something based on vertical length of the page. So depending on how your website is set up, that might be 50% down the page like it is for our website that I showed you guys. So you want your developers to go into the site code and to tell the website to push that event in the data layer when that scroll of 50% is reached. Okay, so it does involve developer support. It's not something you can do out of the box if you want the article completion to fire at a level that's different to the automatically collected scroll. But basically the code would just be a data layer snippet like this that your developers would send as a message on the site with attached parameters. I hope that helps. I think you can, you're always worth trying to see if the scroll event that's out of the box is going to work for you. But yeah, if you've got a different page structure and it needs to fire earlier, you'll need to get a developer to push it earlier on the page. Can I share that the PDF of webinars will be available under resources after the webinar ends? I believe this is true. I might have to ask Lim for an advice on this one. I'm pretty sure we are sharing. Oh, that is from Lim. Sorry. Thank you, Lim. Sorry, Lim is in the background being my very helpful question moderator, Lim from Google. So she just sent me a question that I thought was from someone else, but it was actually from her. So yes, Lim, I can answer your question. We will be sharing the PDF of the webinars under resources on the site after the webinar ends. So yeah, I know we went over a lot of technical stuff today, so you can access those resources there afterwards if you want to have a reference point. And you'll also see that on a lot of the slides we had references to articles that'll be really helpful if you are wanting to take on some of this practical hands-on stuff yourself. So keep an eye out for that. Unless there's any other questions, I think we will wrap it up for today. Thank you again, everyone. I know this is a bit more of a technical brain-bending session, but it's a really important one, and I hope it will help with the webinars going forward and with your own journey with GA4. Thank you.